Alrighty, so like I said, today we are going to be going through kind of step by step what my expectations are for each of these sections on the study guide. Okay. All right. So a couple things to keep in mind is that on our learning target documents, which if you have turned yours in, you can still look on it on Google Classroom. There's a list of the key vocabulary terms that you guys will need to know. So you have access to that if you'd like to review those vocabulary terms. I'm not going to write them all on here. That just wouldn't be very timely for our space. Okay. All right, so please follow along on your study guides while I go through, and then make any changes if you got any sections incorrect, or maybe if you just have something slightly different. I would go ahead and just document everything that we have up here together. Okay? All right. So there's a couple key things that you'll need to be able to do on the unit test. So you'll need to be able to look at a energy pyramid here, or a trophic pyramid, and be able to tell us a couple things about it. So if you remember, one of the first things that we talked about this semester was what we call the 10% rule. Okay, so if we look here, this is kind of similar to what I'm going to be asking you to do based on kind of our 10% rule. Okay, so I might ask you to be able to come up with some values that show the 10% rule. Okay. So let's say, for example, that at our bottom level, which let's go ahead and name this here, because we do need to know what each of the trophic levels are called. Okay, so the bottom is always going to be called the producer, right? Then we're going to have the primary consumer. Then we're going to have the secondary consumer. Okay, and then past that is the third or tertiary consumer. And then one that I'm not going to be expecting you guys to know, but this next one is technically called the quaternary consumer. We're only requiring that you understand up to tertiary. Would you mind just hanging on to it for a little bit? Yeah, sorry. I just want to make sure we can go through everything, and then, yeah, just put a little star by it. That'd be great. Okay. So now, one thing that a lot of us struggled on our formative assessment is knowing that each of these are called trophic levels. So if I ask you to list what trophic level the grasshopper is from, I'm asking you to tell me that it's a primary consumer. Okay? All right, so now with the value. So let's say for the frog here, that when the frog eats the grasshopper, let's say that it gets 30 kilocalories of energy. Okay. So if we're following the 10% rule, okay, how much energy would the snake get from the frog? It would be 3 kilocalories. Okay, or 10% of 30. The hawk here, if it ate the snake, would get 0.3 kilocalories. Okay. Now we can also go in the other direction. We can go further down. So when the grasshopper eats the grass, okay, we can show how much energy it received by just using our 10% rule. So 30 is 10% of 300 kilocalories. So this means that the grass, when it absorbed the energy of the sun and converted it into glucose, sorry, that got a little tight there, had 3,000 kilocalories. So notice how each time you go up a trophic level, it's 10% of the previous one. Now, one thing that I saw a lot of people struggle with on our formative assessment was when I asked you to come up with an evidence statement. Okay? When you are just writing an evidence statement, this is just going to be our data or numbers. If I asked you for a reasoning statement, then you would have some sort of an explanation. So a good evidence statement here would be that, so we could say the frog has 30 kilocalories of energy. When the snake eats the frog, it receives 3 kilocalories. I'm sorry, I got a little tight there again, of energy. So notice how this doesn't have any explanation in it whatsoever. An evidence statement is not asking you to explain why that supports the 10% rule. Evidence statement is just asking for your data or your numbers. So here we're just looking at the difference between the frog and the snake's energy. So be careful when we're talking about that. And again, we're in this case, we're talking about a CER, right? Now, we're not going to be writing a full CER on our upcoming test. We're kind of breaking it up into pieces, okay? So to make that a little bit easier for you guys. Okay. All right. So moving on here. Okay. Explain why 90% of the energy stays at a trophic level and only 10% transfers to the next level. So the reason for that is because the remaining 90% of energy is lost as heat. So us as living organisms are actually very inefficient. We actually don't use most of the energy that we take in. It gets wasted through our metabolic processes. So we only get access to 10% of the food that we eat. So whatever you had for breakfast today, you only were able to access 10% of that energy to help you function, to help you sit upright, to help your organs function, to help your brain think. So unfortunately, we're very inefficient. Most of the energy is going to be lost as heat. Okay. So now let's go ahead and transition into kind of a different way to look at a similar idea here. Okay. So we've got this food web right here. Okay. So we're going to be trying to list a 3 trophic level food chain. Now, our trophic level food chains are always going to be starting with our producer, right? So let's have our 3 trophic level chain right here. Let me slide that down a little bit more. Okay. So our 3 trophic level food chain, let's say that we're starting with the grass. Then let's go to the grasshopper. Then let's go to the frog. Okay. So we've got 3 trophic levels. We've got our producer, our primary consumer, and our secondary consumer here. 3 trophic levels. So if we can do 3, 5 should be pretty easy. We're just going to do a little bit more. We'll have 2 more organisms in there. So this time, let's start with the tree. Okay, let's say that the tree is eaten by the caterpillar. The caterpillar is then eaten by the robin. The robin is eaten by the fox. And then the fox is eaten by the mountain lion. So if we look there now, we have 5 organisms showing a 5 trophic level food chain. Okay. All right, so if we think about this here, okay, so if we have the tree being eaten by the caterpillar, okay, so this to this, what percent of energy is available at the caterpillar trophic level? Okay, it's going to be 10%, right? Our 10% rule. That should be pretty easy. Okay. And then last but not least on this page, we've got talking about decomposers. So obviously the role of decomposers is going to be to recycle dead and decaying materials, which we could also say nutrients, back into the ecosystem. Okay. All right, so again, if you have any questions, just please hang on until the end and we can kind of just talk through all of them there. And I do appreciate your guys' patience while we go through this here. And if there's any part that you missed and you want to just check this closer to the end of class, that's totally fine with me. Okay. Okay. So when we're talking about the nitrogen cycle, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the nitrogen cycle and looking at the mystery of the green fish tank and all that, and talking about eutrophication and things like that. So why is nitrogen important? Why do we spend so much time talking about it? Well, all organisms need nitrogen in order to survive. So you need nitrogen to form nitrogenous bases, which you don't really need to know what that term is. We'll visit it more when we start talking about DNA. But if you're familiar with these letters, A, T, C, G, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine, if you're familiar with those are made up of nitrogen, right? That's why we need our nitrogen in order to survive, is to make our DNA. Without it, no life on Earth would be able to survive. So if we remember correctly, you can actually breathe in nitrogen, but you cannot access it that way. Nitrogen makes up a majority of the atmosphere, but it enters your lungs when you take a breath in, but it leaves your lungs when you breathe out. You can't take in that nitrogen through your lungs. You can only take in oxygen and expel carbon dioxide. So we can access nitrogen by eating foods that have taken in nitrogen. And they've taken in that nitrogen from nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So if you remember correctly, some of our examples of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, if you look down at the next ones here, were Nitrospira and then Nitrosomonas. So I'm not going to require that you know what those recite. If I tell you, okay, what is Nitrospira, tell me what it is. But you will need to be able to look at a diagram like this and understand that those are types of bacteria. Okay. All right. So if a large amount of nitrates from fertilizers are dumped into river systems, what might be one of the negative implications for the ecosystem? So if we remember correctly, that is the process of eutrophication. Okay. And eutrophication is when algae, which is a producer, it creates food from the energy of the sun, grows, we could say exponentially, but let's probably not use that term here, grows out of control, let's say, and causes a massive die-off in the ecosystem. Okay. Okay. So describe how nitrogen cycles through living and non-living things. So basically all we need to know are that nitrogen-fixing bacteria provide nitrogen to plants. Plants and organisms that eat the plants die, and decomposers return nitrogen to the soil. Okay. 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 So that's kind of the big picture ideas that we need to know from nitrogen cycle. Okay. And again, I appreciate your guys' patience. I know this is a little monotonous, but I think this is really important to get everyone kind of caught up on what we missed or what I wasn't here to help you guys with over the last couple weeks. Mystery of the green fish tank activity. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. So if the population of bacteria or Nitrospira decreases by 80%, so the Nitrospira population is going down, okay, then how will this affect the nitrite and nitrate levels in the fish tank? So if we think about this here, I know it's probably difficult for you guys to see on the screen here, but this are our nitrites and these are our nitrates. So if the nitrospira takes in the nitrites and releases nitrates, if we've decreased the amount of nitrospira, okay, that's going to increase the amount of nitrites because there's less nitrospira taking it in. And then that's going to decrease our amount of nitrates because there's less nitrospira producing those nitrates. Okay? So this would be a good example of how you would use the evidence here in our little diagram to use reasoning. So this is going to be kind of a reasoning section. Okay? All right, so you could say something along the lines of the amount of nitrites would increase due to the fact that the nitrospira population decreased. So less nitrites would be consumed. So this in turn would decrease the amount of nitrates, being produced. So we're decreasing nitrospira. That means more nitrites, less nitrates. Okay. All right, and again, if you have any questions, please just put a little star by it and we can come back to it in a couple minutes. Okay. So this one, to be honest, is something that we didn't explicitly talk about in here. I know some of the other classes might have talked about it more explicitly. But basically what we're looking at here is when we're talking about matter cycling, okay? When we're thinking about cycles, we're thinking about circles. Things being reused over and over and over again. Energy flows because energy is moving in one direction. So if we were to go back to looking at like these trophic levels, the frog is eaten by the snake, and that energy is just going from the frog to the snake. It doesn't go back to the grasshopper or something like that. The materials, the nutrients, and the things that make up that frog will eventually be recycled, but the energy is only used once. Okay? So what we're trying to say here is that matter and energy, matter and nutrients change and can be reused. And we could say they could be reused by other organisms. Energy cannot be reused. once it has been used, it is gone. Okay. Okay. All right, so I know you guys are probably feeling pretty fried at this point, so I'm going to try and kind of speed this up a little bit. And the last couple sections are really not too tricky. It's really pretty straightforward. So this is similar to, this next part is similar to what we talked about earlier. So looking at a food web, being able to see how some of these populations of organisms are connected to each other. So if the populations of rabbits increases by 50%, okay, predict what would happen to the fox population. So if we have more rabbits and 50% more rabbits, that means that there's going to be more food for the foxes. So the fox population is also going to increase. And it'll increase because of the greater number of prey. Okay, so same thing. If the rabbit population increases by 50%, what would happen to the bluegrass population here? So if we look at that, there's more rabbits that are going to be around eating these grasses, so the grass population will decrease. Okay. And we could say because of the greater number of rabbits. Okay. Now there's actually one more little section here that I think we should probably mention. So let's just kind of talk about another example. And this is kind of more of what we call a trophic cascade. So let's say that looking at the grains to the grasshoppers to the owls. Okay. So let's say, for example, that we have a let's see here. Yeah, let's use the same one now that I think about it. So let's say that we've got these rabbits here, and the rabbit population increased, so then the grass population decreased. So let's think about what happened to the grasshoppers here. So because the rabbit population increased by 50%, they ate more of the grasses. So what would happen to the grasshopper population? Okay, the grasshopper population would decrease because there's less food available to them. Almost there, guys. Let's go ahead and power through this last page. Okay. All right, so exponential growth versus logistic growth. We're talking about changes in populations. Okay. All right, so an exponential growth curve would be something that looks like this. If this is the number of organisms and this is time. Okay. So some examples of this would be things like bacteria and also human beings. Now, the reason why bacteria and human beings would follow this kind of growth pattern is because they have access to unlimited resources. And no natural predators. Now, obviously, yes, there are a limit to the number of resources that we have on Earth. And yes, technically there are some things that could predate us, right? That could eat us. But we've kind of moved beyond those things, and we haven't hit the total number of resources that are available to human beings on Earth, because we've been able to travel all over the world and be able to learn how to harvest and grow crops. So we've been able to increase our number of resources dramatically than if we were just hunting and foraging for food. So exponential growth means that it's going to just continue to increase, nothing stopping it. It just continues to go up. Okay, so a logistic growth curve is going to be much more realistic for most organisms. So same thing, we've got number of organisms and time. Okay, so we could typically have the beginning section of this population chart is going to have an exponential point to it, but then it's going to level off. And eventually that population will increase, and then it'll decrease and increase again. So that is what we call the carrying capacity. Okay. So this part here, let's just kind of list it up here. That right here, or this section, we could call this the exponential growth section. Okay, but then it hits a point where that population can no longer grow anymore. So you could literally list just about any organism out there. The wolves in Yellowstone, beavers, who knows? You can have elk, whatever. All organisms that exist out in nature are going to be subject to limiting factors. So limiting factors, basically things that are going to create that carrying capacity, creating the maximum number of organisms that can survive in an area. So these are going to be things like competition between other species, disease, access to food and water, having available space to live or habitat, or predation, certain number of predators. Okay. All right. So looking at this here, and I know on some of these copies it just might have gotten a little bit dark here. But if we look at this here, determining the carrying capacity is actually pretty simple. Now, there's a couple ways you could do it. You could take the average of each of these points, but to be honest, I'm okay if when we're looking at one of these logistical growth curves, if we just approximate where the middle line is for that. So notice how this one here, I kind of tried to draw the carrying capacity through the middle there. So we could say that it's approximately there. So we could say maybe that's around 42 or 43,000. In this case, we're talking about snowshoe hares. So carrying capacity is basically just in the middle of those peaks and valleys later on. Now again, you're not really factoring in this part because this section is exponential growth. There's no limit to that growth there. Okay. All right. So if we look here, okay, so now we're going to take a quick peek at predator versus prey graph here. Now, I know that these questions are talking about carrying capacity. To be honest, I'd rather you be able to look at a carrying capacity like this. What I really want you to pull out of this graph here is the relationship between how the wolf population impacts the moose population and how the moose population impacts the wolf population. Okay, so kind of similar to what we talked about earlier, I'd like you to pick out some key parts and be able to see over time what happened. So the dark line here, these are the moose population, and the light line here, that is the wolf population. Now keep in mind with the total number of each of these. So the maximum number of wolves is 50. The maximum number of moose is 2,500. Okay, so there's always going to be more moose than there are wolves. There's always going to be more prey than predators. If there's not, that ecosystem won't survive for very long. Okay, so if we look here initially at the first part here, okay, so we've got this wolf population. That's pretty high. It hits a little bit of a peak right here. And if you notice, the moose population is pretty low. So if we look here, okay, at this point, the carrying capacity of this environment for wolves, if we're just looking at the number of prey, was about, we could say maybe 13 moose. Or sorry, this would be like 600 moose, sorry. And then it would probably be about 30 wolves. So the carrying capacity here is about 30. And that's in about, let's say 1965. Yeah, let's say that. Okay. So then the wolves hit their carrying capacity, meaning there wasn't enough food to go around for them. So then their population plummets. So then what happens when the wolf population goes down? There's less predators. So that means there's going to be more prey that are able to survive. So then the prey population increases. Okay. All right. So then at this point here, now there's not, I should say at this point right here, there's not many wolves going around, so the moose population increases, but then there's more moose around, so then the wolf population increases, and the wolf population increases a ton all the way up to here. Okay, so then if we look at this here, now there's lots of wolves and not enough moose to go around, so then the moose population decreases. Okay, so now the super high wolf population, there's definitely not enough food to go around, so then because the moose population went down, now the wolf population goes down. Now we could go through and calculate each of these carrying capacities at each of these points and then find the average between all of them. Frankly, we're not going to have to do that on the unit test, And for time's sake, I think we're just going to pass on that for these. But basically what you would do to solve for these, and we can look at it for the moose population here at this point, and let's say that's 73. The peak of the moose population in 1973 was, let's say, maybe 20 or 1,250 moose. Okay, so you could go through, look at multiple dates, find the average, and be able to calculate it that way. But if we think about this here, what I really care about is knowing that when the moose population increases, then the wolf population is going to increase. But then because the wolf population increases, then the moose population is going to decrease. And then there's not enough food to go around, so then the wolf population decreases. So we get this repeating pattern that's called a lagging pattern. Okay. So that's kind of the big picture idea here, and that shows how they're connected. Okay, and just to kind of answer this one here, why is the carrying capacity of these two populations different? And we could say because there's always going to be fewer predators than prey. Okay. And you could go back and talk about, like we mentioned earlier, looking at trophic levels, there's always going to be more lower organisms than there is higher organisms. There's just not enough energy because of the 10% rule to sustain it. Okay. All right, so last but not least here. Okay. And this is kind of going back to what we talked about first this semester, talking about dependent versus independent variables. So when you're looking at a graph, okay, remember the independent variables are usually going to be on the x-axis. Dependent variables are usually going to be on the y-axis. And we need to remember that the dependent variable is what is being measured by the experimenter. Okay. The independent variable is what is being changed or manipulated in an experiment. So thinking back to our pill bug labs, a lot of you guys chose different temperatures, right? Or the dry versus moist environments, right? So let's say that in the pill bug lab, the temperature change, so the temperature of the chamber would have been what we changed there. What we were measuring was the number of pill bugs on each side. Okay. All right. So thank you guys so much for your patience with that. So if you have any questions with any of these, please feel free to reach out to your teacher, and you'll see further information about when the upcoming unit test is going to be from them. So thank you so much. I hope that's helpful, and have a great day.